So without much ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, John Spoehr. Associate Professor John Spoehr is the Executive Director of the Australian Workplace Innovation Social Research Centre at the University of Adelaide. He has published widely on social, economic and industry policy, and he specialises in socio-economic impact assessment, particularly understanding the implications of economic shocks. He is also the founder of the Stretton Centre in Northern Adelaide, which is a focal point for industrial transformation in Adelaide's northern suburbs. Today, John is going to speak to us on the presentation called The Great Transformation, Industrial Shocks and Industrial Transformations, and he's going to be focusing on the design and implementation of the best possible strategic responses to assist affected workers, particularly in their transitions to new jobs, as we look towards the closure of Australia's automotive manufacturing industry. I look forward to the insights that he's going to provide into the potential scale of the shock and the importance of ensuring that the response is in proportion to this. He's going to cover off both the short-term and long-term responses and what we need to do in industrial and workplace change. Please welcome John to the stage.
Thanks so much, Jodie-Ann. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today in Melbourne at this very important event, very timely event as we approach 2017. And 2017 is not a year I'm looking forward to, I have to say, as somebody who's been a close observer of what's likely to unfold as a consequence of the closure of the Australian auto industry. My task, as Jodie-Ann has indicated, is to provide some context, I think, to today's proceedings and look at the scale of the shock, and I think you've probably picked up on some of the work that we've done in collaboration with the National Institute for Economic and Industry Research based here in Melbourne. I'll talk a little bit about the findings of that, and then I'll reflect on the centrality of the auto industry and why we should be focusing a lot of attention on how we might increase our efforts to ensure that the skills that are embedded in that sector are put to good use in other sectors, and why that's a critically important thing, not just for those people who lose their jobs as a consequence of the closure of the industry, but why it's important for the nation as a whole, particularly important for South Australia, Victoria, but also very important for other states which are less known for auto manufacturing, but nevertheless an integral part of the automotive industry. So much more is lost from the demise of the automotive industry than merely the ability to manufacture, engineer and build cars. Auto manufacturing has been and has to a large extent remained Australia's most developed, integrated and complex value chain, despite the progressive lowering of local content in Australian production over the past decade. Some of the enabling competences and technologies inherent in automotive manufacturing and engineering include systems integration, materials science and engineering, process engineering, automation and control technologies, electronics and miniaturisation, digital content, sensing and simulation, high tooling skills, and so on and on and on. So many valuable, important skills are embedded in the sector. These are vital competences that can and are built in automotive manufacturing and then applied across other critical endeavours such as defence, medical and assistive technologies, food production, machine tools, mining and resources, and a wide range of technologies and so on and so on. Today, our objective should be to identify and maximise applications for these capabilities outside of automotive, in high growth, local and global value chains, in new manufacturing and related services. The vet sector should and must be a key player in this process. So what are the local, statewide and national impacts of the automotive closure? I'll touch on them briefly today, but you can go to our website at the Australian Workplace Innovation and Social Research Centre and download a number of reports that we've done on this, and also download the data by local government area if you like. We commissioned National Economics to model the impact of the closure, and they estimated the aggregate impact to be a net loss of just under 200,000 jobs nationally. That's a big number. I know that has shocked a lot of people. there are a number of assumptions underpinning that are important to understand. This number is a number that gives us an indication of the significance of the industry to Australia. It's not the number of jobs that are going to be lost. It's the significance of the industry to Australia. The number of jobs that are going to be lost is another question altogether. But the importance of that report was to give us an understanding of the significance of the industry, if you take it out of the Australian economy, what might be its significance out to 2018. Around 100,000 jobs are lost from Victoria. Let's see if I can, there we go. Here's a map that just gives you a sense of the spatial distribution of the automotive closure shock. Around 100,000 jobs are lost from the Victorian economy, while South Australia loses 24,000 according to the modelling. The balance of jobs is shared amongst other states less dependent on automotive production. As I said, these figures represent the losses viewed as the total of jobs lost and jobs not created as a result of the closure. And one of the key assumptions underpinning this modelling was that the exchange rate would be more favourable for the auto industry. And as we've seen since the announcements of by most of the auto producers, the dollar has indeed come down, and it's come down a long way. So auto manufacturing is currently much more competitive. Indeed, manufacturing is much more competitive at the moment than it was a few years ago. And that augurs well. I'll return to that, or I might be able to return to that later on. So manufacturing can grow on the back of a lower Australian dollar, despite the enormous challenges associated with that, given the rise of India and China and other parts of the world as low-cost manufacturing destinations. The effect on national gross domestic product, according to the modelling, is a permanent loss of around about $29 billion. That's a big hole. The basic reason for the largeness of the impact is the fact that the automotive sector is an area of complex manufacturing involving complex supply chains and a whole range of interdependencies. The impacts will go well beyond the direct jobs lost and the usual second, third and fourth round multiplier effects that are associated with the modelling. So this is the baseline scenario, and as I've said, the exchange rate is the fundamental determinant in that. Beyond these overall aggregate impacts, the temporal and spatial dimensions are of great importance, and they're underscored in some of these maps that showed 3 months after closure, 1 year after closure, 2 years after closure, 3 years after closure, and 4 years after closure. So it's important to understand, as I've said at the outset, that the implications of the closure of the entire industry are a problem for the nation as a whole, not just for those states that have GMH, Ford and Toyota based in them. Of course, areas like the north of Adelaide and the south of Adelaide are very heavily hit by this, and I know there are parts of Victoria and parts of New South Wales that will be very heavily hit, and parts of my state indeed already have unemployment rates well in excess of 15 to 20%. Male unemployment rate in South Australia is around about 8.8%, and the labour underutilisation rate in South Australia is around about 17%. So this is a difficult economic and social backdrop against which the automotive closure is going to occur. It's a much more difficult environment than, say, compared to the closure of Mitsubishi back in 2008, where manufacturing was not going through the severe difficulties it is now, and we weren't experiencing rising unemployment in the way that we are at the moment. So very important when you're assessing the impact of a major shock like this to do so in the current context, that is the prospect for jobs growth in any particular area, any particular state. And you have to say that in Australia at the moment we have a patchwork economy that's been exacerbated by, of course, the impacts of declining demand for energy and minerals that are impacting on Western Australia and Queensland in particular, which mean there are fewer jobs for South Australians to retreat to in those states and fewer jobs for Victorians to retreat to in those states. So very important to understand that as the sort of national backdrop. While manufacturing remains one of South Australia's largest employers and will continue to be so in years to come, the reality is that we've lost around about 30,000 jobs in manufacturing in the sector over the last 3 decades. So that's even before the auto shock takes place. To put this in perspective, total employment in the mining sector rose to around about 15,000, but it's now in significant decline in South Australia as it is elsewhere. So it doesn't, it's not going to provide those much needed replacement jobs that we need at the time we need them. 2017, 2018, 2019 will be the critical time. In the meantime, it's smart to lay the foundations to capture the benefit of any upswing in mining that might come. It will come again, but we don't know exactly when it will come. Our largest and fastest growing sector in South Australia, as it is in so many other parts of the nation, is, of course, community services, health and social assistance. Employment's doubled in that sector in South Australia since the mid-1980s to around about 110,000. Overall, workers losing their jobs in the automotive sector have fewer opportunities available to them than in the recent past, particularly in those sectors they are best equipped to work in. Some have argued that the growth in community services, health and ageing can fill the jobs gap created by the closure of the auto industry and the loss of jobs in manufacturing and mining and energy. And to some extent it will, but we have to acknowledge that the knowledge and skills gained in the auto industry are not readily transferable to the service sector. I know there's some interesting work that NCVER has commissioned in this respect. This is particularly a problem for some auto workers that have gained competences on the job but don't have formal recognition of these. And while recognition of prior learning will help bridge this gap, significant retraining will be necessary in most cases to make successful transitions to care-based jobs. It should also be noted that much care-based employment is casual and part-time, and compared to the predominantly full-time employment of manufacturing is, of course, much less well paid. Australia has a very short time to effect a transition to new manufacturing opportunities. The transition needs to be based in large part on core capabilities related to automotive, but not on building cars. Building cars in the short term is a difficult option for us to envisage, although in South Australia, a company called Ethan Automotive has dared to suggest that it will make cars over the next few years. It's looking at making an SUV in South Australia. I wish it all the best with that. I hope it succeeds, but one has to be pessimistic in the current environment about the likely success of that. We must be clear that in the short term, what we're putting in place is essentially a defensive strategy. The central objective of this strategy would be to help retain core engineering, technology and organisational competences that would be lost otherwise, and to retain these as the platform for longer-term industrial growth and rejuvenation. But there's no glossing over the fact, even if successfully implemented, such a strategy would not and could not compensate fully the scale of the losses in prospect from the automotive closure. A complementary package of short-term growth measures will be required to help fill the jobs hole created by the closure. And what specifically is the model of new manufacturing to which we might want to transition? We know that Australia will struggle to be competitive in forms of manufacturing where the basis of competition remain scale of production and unit cost. The end of the Australian auto manufacturing sector attests to the difficulties that Australia faces in being a competitive manufacturer where scale and unit cost is king or queen. We cannot, as I've said, compete with China and India. But changes in technology and international supply chains, greater and greater specialisation and complexity, together with innovative business organisation, have opened up new opportunities for internationally competitive manufacturing based on short-run production, high variability, rapidity to market, and high-value products exhibiting medium to high complexity. These changes have opened up opportunities for small and medium enterprises and clusters of these enterprises in increasingly specialised, interdependent global supply chains. This is what we mean by new manufacturing or advanced manufacturing. New manufacturing also involves the application of new technologies such as additive manufacturing or 3D printing, uses of new materials such as titanium and graphene. It applies so-called key enabling technologies such as photonics and nanotechnology. These are areas of research and development in which Australia has proven excellence, and they help to take us from scale and cost-based production in which we have little future into highly sophisticated, complex niche production through which we can avoid head-to-head competition with the industrial powerhouses to our north. Critically important for Australia, alignment to new manufacturing means that being small need no longer be a disadvantage. Examples abound of small, high-cost countries that have actively sought out and secured positions of international competitive advantage, moving up the value chain to compete less on cost and price factors and more on agility and new manufacturing characteristics. These include, and you know them well, Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries, Singapore and others, but also includes the United States and the UK, who are also very aggressively pushing into advanced manufacturing at the moment, investing billions of dollars in this agenda. These countries recognise that building and sustaining positions of competitive advantage is about more than technology, vital though this is, and it includes a rigorous understanding of demand and global market and value chain opportunities and recognition of the critical role of complex non-price factors and workplace and sector-wide organisation and strategy. Industry transformation and diversification must be front and centre of the response to the closure of the auto industry. There are clear international lessons and guides from regions that have fought back successfully against major shocks like the collapse of the auto industry. And here are some of those lessons. First, the need for an integrated plan of interdependent actions covering the short, medium and long terms and covering key stimulus categories from industry diversification to infrastructure development to urban regeneration to health and ageing, amongst other areas. Front and centre, as I've said, is industry diversification and transformation. This involves understanding opportunities within local and global supply chains aligned to the competences local companies may have already or could acquire. Industry diversification can only be achieved over the long term, but it must start now. Understanding the demand drivers is the starting point. The strongest levers for industry diversification are on the demand side, and an understanding of complex and interdependent international value chains is absolutely essential. Technology, as I've said, is vital, but the strategy cannot be supply or technology push alone. Amongst the complex value chains being explored in South Australia are selected defence projects related to armoured vehicles and, of course, submarines, and we're all hoping that we'll get a very positive announcement about 12 submarines being built in South Australia in the not very distant future. I'm much more optimistic about that than I was a few months ago. It includes sophisticated technology inputs to selected resources and energy projects such as copper and complex combined ore bodies and unconventional gas, assistive technologies for older persons and people with a disability, medical devices, both those sectors, assistive technology and medical devices are among the fastest growing internationally. The cellulose fibre chain and new construction materials and technologies such as cross-laminated timbers and prefabricated buildings. A whole of value chain approach to expanding food and horticultural production. In South Australia we have the largest undercover horticultural sector in the nation, and one can expect that there'll be substantial rising demand for clean green horticultural produce here or in South Australia, but also nationally over years to come. Applications of key enabling technologies such as photonics and sensing, visual technologies, advanced material engineering, and so on and so on. While recovery from the collapse of the auto industry will take decades, action must be taken now to help mitigate a multitude of negative impacts. Patient long-term strategies need to be accompanied by job-rich short-term measures that have wider industry and community development benefits associated with them. International and national experience suggests that we need to bring together two self-reinforcing agendas: industrial rejuvenation on the one hand and urban regeneration on the other. Successful job-rich industrial rejuvenation involves the transformation of existing industries as well as the development of new and more resilient ones. In broad terms, it recognises the need to respond strategically and sometimes in transformational ways to structural and cyclical change. Innovation is often seen at the core of close and robust formal and informal linkages between government, industry, unions and the research community. Agile industry networks and clusters situated in sophisticated regional innovation systems are central to this challenge. Many of the ingredients of this already exist, but they're not well integrated, not well coordinated, and we lack some of the institutions that are so omnipresent in Europe, here in Australia, to help bring those agendas together in skillful and smart ways. Urban and regional regeneration, on the other hand, entails the modernisation and revitalisation of ageing infrastructure, including housing stock, transportation systems and civic spaces, creating healthy, stimulating and vibrant spaces to live, work and invest in. This is commonly regarded as the foundation for improving well-being and productivity, essential to building and sustaining successful industries and economies. During periods of crisis, urban generation can play a vital role in boosting domestic demand, creating alternative employment opportunities for those who lose their jobs through downsizing and closure. And it also plays a vital role in boosting regional pride and morale. We know from our experience during periods of recession and from the management of major company closures that it is vital that state, local and national policymakers and policy be directed at bringing forward capital investment in productivity and amenity-enhancing projects in the regions affected by closure. And I was pleased to note that recently in South Australia, after a lot of abiding conflict between the state and the national government, there was agreement to fund the so-called Northern Connector Road project, a project worth around about $900 million. It was looking for some time like there would be little agreement about any major new infrastructure expenditure in South Australia, but unfortunately that impasse has been broken and the prospects of major infrastructure projects being funded, I think, in South Australia and here in Victoria are much greater in the lead up to the closure of the auto industry, and I think that's a very welcome development. International experience attests to the power of urban renewal and a focus on city revitalisation as a driver of industrial rejuvenation. Such revitalisation can drive development of a more robust regional innovation system, or ecosystem if you like. New public buildings and new urban form can help build connectivity and collaboration, better linking cities' businesses to high quality customised training and industry development support and expertise. They can help to bring people together and to attract investors. I know I'm running out of time here. One of the most powerful tools to stimulate innovation and industrial diversification internationally is the use of procurement by public authorities to maximise longer-term public benefit. We've experimented a lot with that in South Australia through the application of so-called smart procurement to drive innovation on the one hand, but also to use major capital works projects as live employment and training projects, but also use them as ways of increasing local content. And in South Australia, there's a pretty sophisticated new approach to driving that through the South Australia's industry participation policy, a policy that I think other states are looking at closely at the moment. Successful regions build innovation systems as the basis for their competitiveness. They build the intellectual and organisational assets and resilience of a region. This involves several elements, but especially, as I've said, promoting collaboration and networks between firms and industry clusters to build flexibility, capability and counter problems associated with small scale. It includes building innovation centres and precincts as focal points for industrial transformation. I know here in Victoria, in Melbourne and also in South Australia, we've been fortunate to get some funding from the Commonwealth to establish some regional innovation facilities. We have one in the north of Adelaide called the Stratton Centre, which was just opened on the 26th of September, and we see that as a bit of a model for how we might foster collaboration, bringing a range of players together around that incredibly important need for a more collaborative approach to how we respond to major shocks and closures. Having a co-design culture that brings together researchers, companies and users in the design and development of new products. If the right actions are taken now, we can avoid escalating unemployment and growing hardship in our hardest hit suburbs. Recognising that we need to act boldly and decisively, that's the starting point. Thanks very much. And I'd be happy to answer any questions with a very limited amount of time we have left.
Are there any questions that people would like to ask John? Of course, we've also got morning tea
I'll take the chewing gum out too. My name's Kathy Doherty. I'm from Queensland University of Technology Education Faculty. Just a query in the string of proposed remedies or responses. You haven't mentioned relocation of the workforce at all. So we're trying to keep communities going that have historically aggregated around work opportunities. Is the relocation of workforce another potential area of response?
Yes, it is. Labour mobility being more limited, I think, at the moment than it has been in the recent past because of the difficulties facing the minerals and energy sector. That was driving substantial employment growth, particularly in Queensland and Western Australia, and to a limited extent in South Australia. So the opportunities that were once available in other states, much fewer than they were. Having said that, there is a role, an important role for encouraging people to relocate where it's clearly impossible to generate the sort of jobs and livelihoods and lifestyles that are, that we aspire to. I note that there was the Productivity Commission report released a report on that very question some months ago on labour mobility in Australia, which is, I think, very instructive in that respect. Yeah.
John, my name's Alan Sparks. I'm down from Brisbane, where I involved with a group training organisation. I was also the program director for the National Apprenticeships Program. I thank you for your presentation, and there's some stark realities in there, but I wonder how much effort has been devoted to actually look at, if we assume the fact of the 200,000 people that this is going to impact on, of the energy, the innovation, the ambition and the life force that's there, which in history, in my view, would argue that they will find a way and be a principal driver of that way. And I think we need to balance what those positive features of that force will be against the negativeness of the impact that's being outlined.
Well, a good point. And there's enormous energy and drive, and there's a lot of creativity and knowledge and skills that can be applied to all sorts of other endeavours, and often they are. Out of crises comes all sorts of creativity and change, and we have to, I think, use this crisis to drive accelerated transformation and change to build the jobs and industries of the future. In my mind, that's fundamentally important. So that's the upside, I think, of how we can use crisis to drive successful change and build resilience industrially and and amongst individuals themselves. But in the face of such an overwhelming shock, rarely do we have a shock like this, except during major downturns. The 1980s and 1990s recessions come to mind. And in South Australia, this is sort of akin to a shock of that nature. It's not like that in other parts of Australia. It's principally like that in South Australia because we are so exposed to manufacturing generally, and this is just part of that wider problem of a massive transition occurring in a relatively short period of time. So long as we get the policy framework in place, state and federal government work closer together, and we take a collaborative approach, we'll work our way through this. But we have to look after those who are going to be the victims of circumstances not of their making.
Can we please thank John for his presentation?